Australia for today's Westpac address taking place here on Ngunnawal country. My name is Jane Norman, the ABC's National Affairs correspondent and a director here at the club. Our guest today is the man who's vying to be the next Deputy Prime Minister of Australia, Nationals leader David Littleproud. Mr Littleproud, we very much appreciate you taking time out from the Wombat Trail today. You can see Wall beside you on the table. Since the beginning of the campaign, we've had the Greens leader address the club. Next week we'll have the Prime Minister, and so opposition leader, if you're watching today, consider this an open invitation for the final week of the campaign. But the Nationals are, of course, defending more than a dozen lower house seats and a handful of Senate spots at this election, facing challenges from some community independents and at least one Nationals defector. You can join the conversation today on Twitter. Our handle is @PressClubAust. Our hashtag is NPC. Please welcome David Littleproud.
Well, thank you, Jane, and to the National Press Club, and to my National Party colleagues and family, and to one and all. Thank you. It's a great honour to stand here before you to address the National Press Club and the nation. My involvement with the National Party started some 40 plus years ago. In fact, in the 1983 Queensland state election, when I stood outside the Chinchilla Courthouse handing out for my father to become the state member for Condamine in the then Bajelki-Peterson government. So to be the leader of the National Party is one of the greatest professional honours of my life. One that I don't take lightly, and one that I take in wanting to leave a legacy. A legacy for the people that our great party have represented and supported for over 100 years. A party that has progressed and evolved, having our roots in farming, but progressing to be a dynamic party that represents now just as many nurses, teachers and police as we do farmers. But our roots will always be in the country and in terms of agriculture. But as our electorates have changed, so too have we. And I've always believed, as a Queensland Nat, in the primacy of our membership and our primacy of our party room. And I'm proud to lead a party room that has led the national debate for the last 3 years. I don't think in living memory there has been a party that has been part of a coalition that has set the national agenda like the National Party has. We are the ones that have had the courage to draw on the collective wisdom of our party room to get to a position that many of which we've wanted for so long, but been prepared to have the courage of our conviction to stand up when issues faced us. And one of the proudest moments of my leadership is when our party room got to a position on The Voice, when only 30% of the country agreed with us in opposing The Voice, which we respected. It wasn't a decision that we made lightly or quickly, despite what some commentators may say. The Prime Minister made it very clear that the mechanics, the machinery of The Voice would be predicated off the Calma-Langton report. In fact, I think it was page 14 to 17. So we took that away, and within our own party room, in a respectful way, we undertook a committee within our party room to go and listen to both the yes and the no case, to understand what that machinery would look like, what that would mean for us who represent some of the most disadvantaged Indigenous Australians in remote areas. And we got to a position predicated on that lived experience after embracing both the yes and no, because we believe that we were repeating the mistakes of the past, those mistakes that people we represent live with to this day. ATSIC Mark II was not the answer to closing the gap. That was not the way to empower local communities to actually endeavour to fix their own challenges and tap into their own opportunities. That was not the way of more bureaucracy. We simply need a better bureaucracy. But it also came back to a guiding principle of our great party, but I believe of our great nation, that all 27 million of us are equal, no matter our race, no matter our religion. And proudly, all 27 million of us have a voice in this parliament just down the road, 271 politicians. And proudly, our nation has elected 11 Indigenous Australians, not to represent just Indigenous Australians, but to represent us all. That's the great country that we have become. That's the great country that we should build on to make sure that where there is disadvantage, and we know to the postcode, that we attack that disadvantage with local solutions. And I'm proud to say that after the Voice referendum result, there was no victory lap by the Nationals or the Liberals. We came back to this place just up the road. We walked into that parliament, and Peter Dutton and I moved a motion to undertake a royal commission into child sexual abuse in Central Australia and to have a forensic audit of the billions of dollars that is being spent that isn't hitting where it should be. We came back with practical solutions, and we've subsequently said that, true to the values of why we oppose the voice, that we've now said that we need to have more localised land councils to empower local elders to face into those challenges but embrace the opportunities that are there for them. Sadly, we have a Prime Minister that divided our country with $450 million of wasted taxpayers' money and yet will not utter the word Indigenous Australian. In fact, he's not even game to go back to Alice Springs. That's a Prime Minister that doesn't have the values and principles to lead our nation together as one and to face into those problems and empower the local people to solve those problems. Instead, it's been cast aside. But we give you that commitment that we will, as part of a Dutton Littleproud government, come back and tackle those issues and empower local elders to solve those problems and embrace the future their way. That's what common sense should be about. We're also proud of the fact that in this election, we're actually putting forward solutions for the nation's biggest problem, cost of living. At the moment, we've got a Prime Minister that is talking about everything else other than cost of living because he's created it. He's creating the cost of living crisis where there are Australians tonight that will not be able to afford to put dinner on the table. He's a Prime Minister that's looking for diversions rather than solutions, that the ideology that he's brought to government over the last 3 years hasn't met the practical reality of what's been bled out of every Australian's wallet. That's not somebody who should be leading our country. And to run around and try and divert with scare campaigns on Medicare, running around with a little green card, when every Australian knows that little green card you can't use without your credit card. But you've got to solve the nation's problems by having the courage to fix them. To say you got it wrong, to say that what you put to the Australian people, that you promised the Australian people, you haven't delivered. You're not going to solve the nation's problems without facing up to fundamentally changing the policies that will shift the dial. And in this country, we are blessed with the resources that many other countries around the world would envy to be able to take advantage of those challenges. And one of those challenges is the cost of food here in this country. And today, we, as a Dutton Littleproud government, within 6 months, will have a national food security plan. Because it's not just about the long-term food security of our country, it's about the here and now, about Australians being able to afford to put dinner on the table. That's the real problem that we face today. And so we've said, as part of this and the elements that make this plan up, is that we are saying and have said well long ago as nationals that the market power that our supermarkets have over our farmers and over you, the consumer, has been abused. The evidence is clear. The evidence is vastly clear. In June, July last year, sheep and beef prices went down by 70 to 80% at the farm gate. At the checkout, they went down by 8%. They're having a red hot crack at you. And the abuse in how they treat Australian farmers, you only have to cast your mind back to what they did to the dairy industry. And I was a rural banker that sat around and had to have those hard conversations, emotional conversations with dairy farmers who had their commodity devalued overnight because the big supermarkets decided to put a ceiling on the price of what their commodity was worth. That's not the Australian way, and that's not how corporates should operate. And so what we've said is we're going to make sure that there is fairness and transparency from the farm gate to your plate. We don't want to fix prices, but we want to make sure there is fairness. Fairness for farmers and fairness for you as consumers, because you can't expect the Australian people to understand variations in farm gate prices and how that should flow on to them. They've got enough going on in their world. So why wouldn't we? Why wouldn't we lean in and make sure that there is fairness and there is a deterrent and consequence for someone doing the wrong thing? The supermarket shouldn't fear me or the coalition. In fact, we already have divestiture powers in this country. We put them in place in 2019. And in fact, one Anthony Albanese supported them when we put in divestiture powers, the big stick legislation, for the big energy companies. Anthony Albanese, in January last year, made the statement when initiating the Code of Conduct review that any power the ACCC wanted, they would get. Within a month, the big CEOs of Coles and Woolworths had got to him, and where they could have everything bar divestiture powers. What do they have to fear? If Coles and Woolworths have done nothing wrong, then that'll never be imposed. But we want to make sure there is structural change and cultural change. And their big solution is infringement notices of $198,000. They'd slip down to Civic down here and pull that out of the till and pay that as a cost of doing business. You need to change culture by having a consequence. And this government is not game to take on big supermarkets when there are Australians tonight that won't be able to eat dinner. We've been given a privileged position to come to this place. Why wouldn't we do something about it and make sure that there is that fairness and transparency for every Australian, including farmers? And when you've got nearly 30% of those in the horticulture sector saying they're out of this business in the next 12 months because of the way that these supermarkets have abused them and used them, because they control the market, they are the market. You've got to make sure that there is fairness. They're not asking for fixed prices, they're asking for fair prices. And that is what we're saying. And so we'll introduce a supermarket commissioner whereby a farmer can confidentially come forward and to put forward their case where they believe there's been a breach of the code. And if the commissioner sees that there is evidence to such, they have a choice. They can either conciliate that back through the supermarket, or if they fear retribution, which is what we have heard in so many inquiries from farmers, then they can accelerate that through to the ACCC, who can then impose a $2 million infringement notice on the spot. That's going to change culture. But if they don't, and in the most egregious cases, then it'll go forward. It'll go forward to a court where they'll determine whether it's more significant in terms of financial penalty or whether it's divestiture powers. But a court should determine that, not politicians. And so this is used around the world. But when you've got a Prime Minister too gutless to stand up when Australians can't eat, where is the values of our Prime Minister and this government? They've lost touch. They've lost touch with what's happening out there. And that takes courage and conviction to stand up and to get it right. And I'm proud of my party room that has wanted this for decades, but we've delivered it as part of a Dutton Littleproud government that will say to every farmer and to every consumer, you will be treated fairly. That's the Australian way, and that's what the National Party have always stood for. But we've also made it very clear, energy is the economy. And unless you fix the energy grid, then we are kicking the nation's problems down the road. In fact, this government has already kicked the energy problem so far down the road, they've spent $7 billion on rebates and subsidies because an all renewables approach will not work. We have ageing coal-fired power fleet. We have to be honest, at some point we are going to have to transition them. And so why wouldn't you look at reliable baseload, zero emissions power? And the scare campaign that the Prime Minister has undertaken, predicated from the Smart Energy Council, an organisation that donates to the Labor Party, runs around with the scare campaign of a $600 billion tag, is disingenuous at best, but a Prime Minister that has trouble with telling the truth. The reality is we've used Frontier Economics, an organisation that both the Labor Party and the Coalition use in economic modelling. Everyone has recognised that they are the preeminent organisation to undertake that. And so our grid, our total grid, will be just over $330 billion. They put their grid, an all renewables approach, just under $600 billion. $263 billion less that Australians will have to pay to have an energy grid that has a mix, that doesn't put all its energy eggs in one basket, doesn't have concentration risk. And I learnt that in grade 8 business economics at Chinchilla State High. I would have thought our learned treasurer might have known about that. I'd given up on Chris Bowen. The reality is there is no country of the industrial scale of the size of Australia that is going down an all renewables path. Tomago smelter, perfect example, takes 950 megawatts of coal and gas every year to keep it going 24/7. To do that with renewables is over 3 gigawatts, plus batteries that need to last more than 20 minutes. But just understand what you would put on the people of Hunter. Transmission lines, solar panels and wind turbines littered across our landscape. We're all for reducing emissions, and this righteous view by Chris Bowen and Anthony Albanese and the Teals is one that we're not against the principle of having a healthier environment, but just understand what you're asking us to burden to bear. When you have Zali Steggall opposing just 6 wind turbines at North Head because of the amenity of life that's going to be imposed on her constituents, she doesn't understand what you're asking of rural and regional Australians. We want to say in our future, one that isn't predicated on renewable energy, one that has jobs. We don't want to have just a few jobs polishing a few solar panels. We want the high-paying jobs that a nuclear power plant bring. Nearly 80% of those that work in a coal-fired power station in Toorong in my electorate will have a job. And you know what? Those people in Kingaroy, Nanango and Yarraman, they want that. They want that future. And for this puerile stunt to turn up in Collie and for everybody to be gullible, the Prime Minister didn't go anywhere near the coal-fired power station at Collie, didn't go outside the staged event of sitting there and listening to those coal-fired power workers about their future, their kids' futures and their grandkids' futures of being able to stay and live there. He went to a renewables project hidden from the reality. And let me just make it clear, there's no need to go in an election campaign where you've already won the votes. We have already won the social licence in those 7 communities. Our polling clearly shows that. In fact, if you want a point, have a look at the last Western Australian election where the Liberal Party got a 15% swing to them in Collie. Now, if it was as visceral in terms of the hate for nuclear power plants in those parts of the world, then I would have thought that the Liberal Party mightn't have done so well. So let's have a mature conversation. Let's have a Prime Minister that's going to look you in the eye and tell you the truth. Not make a number up, but be honest with the Australian people, because you're going to bear this bill. You're going to bear this bill, and we're not going to have an economy that can be run properly. But we've also got to have the courage to fix Anthony Albanese's mistakes, because renewables are not going to do the job, and nuclear is 10 years away. We get that. But in the short term, we have a solution. It's gas. It's your gas. It's the gas that Anthony Albanese and the Labor Party gave away last time they were in government. And I have a personal interest in this because that gas comes from my electorate. And I can tell you, having an Australian gas reservation where Australians get to use their own gas is going to have a direct impact on you, every Australian. Your food bill, food processors will have a 15% reduction in their energy costs, 8% at residential retail. And this is simply saying to those gas companies that we'll respect those foundation contracts. But on that spot cargo, the 300 petajoules that's going out on a boat, that we're going to get first crack at that. That's Australians. That's Australia's use first. And when you've got an energy crisis created by a government that's gone down an all renewables path, then that's our way to be able to put pressure down in the next 12 months. And we're not being draconian to these gas companies. And I need them in my electorate. They employ a lot of people. And that's why those contracts will be respected. We've said we're going to help you. We're going to build the pipelines to increase the capacity to get much of that gas. And in fact, if you look at the Gippsland, there's about 140 petajoules of that 50 to 100 petajoules we need ready to be drilled. They need to be plugged in. And so we've said, while we want to see us get first crack at it, we're going to develop our gas reserves to make sure we don't have this folly again, where ideology gets in the road of practical reality. That's common sense. That is how you fix an energy grid in the short term and in the long term. Give futures to the regional Australians that they deserve, not ones that Teals and the Labor Party think we should have. That's not the Australian way. And so we've been very honest about that. And one of the other things I'm very proud of as a Nationals leader is what we've announced around the Regional Australia Future Fund. This is a $20 billion fund that'll give a $1 billion dividend every year. We are seeding it with $5 billion from Rewiring the Nation, because what we are saying is that we're not going to need the 28,000 kilometres of transmission lines that this mob are going to put in place. And we'll put that $5 billion in to seed fund this. And then from the windfalls of the $350 billion worth of exports that come from us in regional Australia, we're going to take a small slice of the windfall every year. We're going to build that up to $20 billion, invest it, and it will give us a return of $1 billion a year, above and beyond the existing funding model that we already get, because there are funding gaps. Anyone that lives outside the CBD of a capital city will tell you that we need to build the amenity of service and life for those that live in regional Australia who are contributing this $350 billion to keep them there. And one of the real founding reasons why I got into Parliament was that I'm jack of seeing young people leave regional Australia. I'm sick of seeing generations go over the Great Divide and never come back. It's time to bring them home and keep them home. But unless they have the amenity of life and service, then they're not going to be here. And this is a legacy. This is a legacy item that I think goes beyond politics. This is something that both sides of politics should take the political pendulum out of regional Australia's spending model on infrastructure, because we get kicked. When Labor comes in, we lost $30 billion worth of infrastructure, just filling in some potholes. So what we're saying is take the politics out of this. This is a smart way to make sure regional Australians get that extra that fills those gaps. And we've already made that very clear. $500 million going to councils to, lo and behold, fix some roads and build some roads. $250 million in programs that allow local communities and councils to apply for money that will help them in the amenity of their towns to make it more attractive. But the two biggest kickers for me are the health and childcare. We are going to make sure that $100 million of this goes towards 200 Commonwealth-supported places in training doctors, training them in regional Australia, because we know if we train them in regional Australia, they'll stay there. This government extended what we call the designated priority era, which meant foreign doctors who came to this country were formally constrained to working in regional rural areas. They took it away and extended it into the peri-urban areas. And if you're a foreign doctor coming to Australia and you Google Cunnamulla in Western Queensland, or you Google Samford in Brisbane, 6 to 4, they're going to go to Samford. We have had our health services decimated by Anthony Albanese. We are the forgotten Australians. And so we have to make sure there is a fund every year to make sure young people know there is a pathway to look after each other, to have the career, a worthwhile career in medicine, in regional Australia. That is a legacy. That's the legacy the Nationals want to leave. But it's also about attracting people and keeping people here. And we've got a childcare desert right across regional Australia. Now, when I became the leader of the Nats, I didn't want to be a harp in opposition. I went to the Jobs and Skills Summit. And at that point, Anthony Albanese had espoused $4.7 billion in childcare subsidies for families that earned from $300,000 to $500,000. So we're going to get an extra $21,000, $22,000 in rebate. And I get Anthony Albanese's cost of living crisis has stretched into Melbourne and Sydney. I get that. But when we've got families in regional Australia who want to go back to work but can't, just to make $80,000 because they can't find a childcare place, and when I asked them to cut just a little bit of that $4.7 billion just to create at least one new childcare place in regional Australia, they patted me on the back and they turned their back on regional Australia. This is about making sure that regional Australia has a legacy, that young families can stay, can come back, can contribute, can have a career, can be part of regional Australia. And when I became leader, one of the things I did was run around this country and listen to young families. And this was what they were screaming at us about. Do something about childcare. And this $100 million a year will be legislated, locked in, making sure those young families can get a start in life in regional Australia. And so part of our National Food Security Plan is also about biosecurity. It's about making sure that we're going to legislate minimum amounts of biosecurity funding so that it doesn't become a political football. We had the Craik Review in 2016-17 that recommended sustainable funding models. We're not going to charge Australian farmers for the biosecurity costs of their foreign competitors that bring their product into this country, like Anthony Albanese tried to do. He was going to charge Australian farmers $153 million to process foreign competitors' product through our ports to compete with them on Australian shelves. What government in their right mind would do that to Australian farmers? We're not. Those who pose the risk will pay the price. Those are the ones that are potentially bringing in pest and disease in this country, and there will be a cost recovery model. As the Craik Review said, we will make sure there's a workforce. The ag visa will be back. It was a legacy item the National Party secured in the last government, and it will be back. We need to make sure that our people, particularly in horticulture, who plant a crop, know there's someone there to pick it at the end of it. Otherwise, you don't plant. And if supply goes down, prices go up. Even Dr. Jim can't change that in a 6,000-word essay. The reality is we need the tools to continue to be able to produce the food and fibre that you want, you deserve. We're going to get back to basics, filling in those potholes, but we're also going to say live sheep exports come back. That is the first bill I bring back. There is no scientific or economic reason to phase out live sheep. I was the minister when the Awassi hit, and we made some tough reforms, but the reforms mean that we lead the world. And I just say to those that don't agree with live sheep exports or live exports full stop, which is where I fear this government will end up, if we're not there, this market will get taken up by countries that don't have our animal welfare standards. You will see the horrific death of millions of sheep from other markets across the world, like Sudan, Ethiopia, South Africa, who will start to send these sheep. We actually measure to the millimetre the length of wool on each sheep that goes out in a boat, to the kilogram. And also we independently score each boat for the flow of air through those boats. But in those countries, they don't do any of that. They put as many sheep as they possibly can on a boat and they get paid for what's at the other end. These animal activists are morally bankrupt. Morally bankrupt. They are valuing the welfare and the life of a sheep from Australia above that from a sheep from South Africa, Ethiopia or Sudan. Australians don't cut and run. We stay and get the job done, and we do it better than anyone else in the world. And for East Coast politicians to cut a deal with the Animal Justice Party just to get them elected at the last election, all at the expense of 3,000 Western Australian jobs, that's not the Australian way. That's not how Peter Dutton and I will run this country. We're going to predicate on science and on fact. And that is what the Australian people expect of their government. So the choice is clear. We've got a plan to tackle your cost of living here and now. We're going to get gas into the grid. We're going to help you every time you fill up your tank. You're going to drop 25 cents a litre off every tank. It's around $14 every time you fill up. We're going to give you a tax cut, particularly those low and middle income earners. Because you know what? They're the ones tonight that are struggling to put food on the table. They're the ones that need the support. They're the ones that we need to acknowledge we need to get them through this. But unless you've got the courage to stand up and to fix the nation's problems, we're going to kick this down the road for another 3 years. And just think of that if you've got Anthony Albanese, Adam Bandt in coalition government, with a sprinkle of Teals and independents putting fairy dust right across Canberra. God help this country. This is time for courage in leadership. And that is what Peter Dutton and I are prepared to do. Prepared to look you in the eye, tell you how it is, we're going to get on with the job. That's what you want from a government, to get on with a job and to get out of your life. But I'm proud to lead a national party that has had the courage over the last 3 years to lead this nation with the values and principles that are dear to us, but I think dear to most Australians. That's what you want in leaving a legacy. That's why I'm in Parliament, to unlock the potential of those men and women and kids that live in regional rural Australia, to give them the hope that many of you take for granted. So when the National Party's strong, regional Australia is strong, and Australia's strong. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for your address. Impressively presented with no notes and no auto cue today.
I can't read speeches, I get bored.
Well, you were very entertaining and had a lot in there that my colleagues will definitely want to be digging into. But I wanted to take you back to another speech you gave recently. It was at the Liberal Coalition launch in Sydney. And I think this comment sort of flew under the radar a bit. It was about the all-important coalition agreement, the deal done between the Nationals and Liberals in government to decide policies, front-bench positions. Now, you suggested in that speech that you don't need it to be written down. It could just be a verbal agreement between you and Peter Dutton. I'm just wondering if that actually is your position, and how then would you preserve the party's interests and preserve a front bench share for the Nationals if all you've got is a kind of a wink and a nod from a future Peter Dutton Prime Minister?
Well, Jane, there is a coalition agreement. There always is. The coalition agreement is very broad, and it goes into the real mathematics of the positions that people hold and the quotas predicated on the number that you have in a party room. But outside that, there is usually sometimes written agreement, depending on who the two leaders are, about policy positions. Now with Peter, I haven't had to do that. I've been able to look him in the eye. That's why I got divestiture power, got nuclear. That's why I've been able to sit down with him around the Regional Australia Future Fund, because he understood how important those things were to me. And every leadership team is different. I work on a simple principle, being from Western Queensland. You treat people how they treat you, and if you have comfort in that, you carry on with that. If they do you over, then you get it in writing. But outside that, I haven't had to, because I trust Peter Dutton. We haven't always agreed, and that's a good thing. That's actually a really good thing for our democracy, that while we haven't necessarily agreed, and I haven't got everything that I've wanted, and I don't think he's got everything he wanted, but what we've got is better policy outcome for our nation. You should have diversity of ideas between two parties. That's a great thing, and you should be able to express that. Not this cookie cutter approach that if you go outside the norm with Labor, you get punted. I don't think that's healthy for our democracy. So there is a coalition agreement, but outside that, in policy positions, I think my record over the last 3 years demonstrates not necessarily just my negotiating power, but the fact that Peter and I can work together. I think that's a very, very strong sign for the Australian people, that if you get a Dutton Littleproud government, we're going to sort stuff out. We're going to get on with the job and do it, because we're going to do what's best for the country. That's why I'm in Parliament, to leave that legacy, and I can only do it with the Liberal Party, and they can only do it with me. And that is a working relationship that's worked for over 100 years, and I hope works for 100 more.
But over those 100 years, it would be convention to have a written agreement, right? For at the very least, to have an insurance policy. Should something happen if the coalition wins and, you know, the pressure of government bears down on the two parties and fractures arise, would it not be convention to have that written down? So
just so you understand, there is. That is the coalition.
But it's just on the coalition to front bench share.
It works out on a quota position. That's nothing earth-shattering. It's pure mathematics. As John Howard once said, politics is the brutal game of arithmetic. That's exactly how it is. But when there are policy positions that in fact present themselves during a term, sometimes previous leaderships may have to have had written letters giving assurances. I haven't asked for that. If I've sat down with Peter on those issues outside the coalition agreement, we've talked them out as two human beings that are trying to do the right thing by this country. That's what we've done. That's how I think most Australians out there would expect us to operate together for the greater good of our nation. And that's what Peter and I have been able to do. Now, what happens in the future will be up to whoever successive leaders are in the future, and I suspect there's been leaders in the past that have done exactly what Peter and I have been able to do. But that's how I do business, and that's how Peter's done business. But there is a coalition agreement that'll stay in place. It's been in place for 100 years, and I suspect it'll be there for many more.
And thank you for clearing that up, right? Our first question today is Karen Farlow from the Saturday paper.
Hello, I like hearing about legacy. Thanks very much for being here. The campaign focus has pretty much been on Middle Australia and things like home ownership, incredibly important. Some of the offerings have been seen as quick fixes and relatively modest. I'm interested in not so much Middle Australia, but the lowest paid people in society, many people in regional Australia. What can you tell me about their need, what they're being offered by the coalition, and related, if I may, because it just takes a sidestep. There's been criticisms of the campaign largely being seen as lacklustre and lacking ideas for big reforms. Now, I'm interested in what you can tell me about that, because if there is ambition, a bit of pizzazz on the coalition side, why is it coming so late in the campaign when people are already voting?
Well, just be careful about what might be excitement for the gallery compared to what's happening out there on the ground. There are cost of living struggles in regional and rural Australia as there is in metro. And so that's what we've said. People on low incomes, pensioners, they drive cars. And every time they go to fill up, they're going to save 25 cents a litre. They're going to save $14 every time they fill up. They're going to do that as soon as we're elected. We've also said to those that are on that 44,000 range through to 104, ranging up to 144 as it phases out, you're going to get a tax cut. We're going to implement a tax cut for you to make sure that we can give you that relief. But unless you've got the courage to stand up and fix the problem, and energy is the economy, you're going nowhere. And we can get gas into the grid quickly. That is the one commodity that we can shift the dial in bringing down energy prices, because that's the one commodity that can be drilled quickly and with a little bit of impetus can be put into the grid quickly. That goes to food processors who are paying 3, sometimes 4 times what they were 3 years ago. When you're going to reduce their bill by 15%, that has a flow-on impact right through the economy. There aren't silver bullets. I think we've also got to understand, we've got to get back to basics. And there is a human toll that I think, Karen, you have quite rightfully identified. And those human tolls is what I don't think economists see in some of their commentary, because economists work in numbers. We work in the human toll that we see. We see the people in Dubbo, some of them living in tents underneath a bridge because they can't afford their mortgage and they've had to move with the kids to sleep underneath it in a tent to rent their home out. So we see it through the human eyes of the pain that's there. And so that's why this short-term relief, while we actually have the courage to fix up the fundamentals, is so important. So there are no silver bullets because we're basically broke. This mob has spent a lot of your money. They've spent $7 billion in papering over the cracks because they didn't have the courage to admit they've got it wrong on their all renewables approach. That takes courage in leadership, and that's what Peter Dutton and I are prepared to give.
Andrew Probyn.
G'day, Andrew Probyn. First of all, speaking as a director of the Press Club here, thanks very much for turning up, and we do hope that we see Peter Dutton here next week. We will also have the Prime Minister. Now, as to what you said today, you described the Prime Minister's visit to Collie as a puerile stunt, and you said that there was no need for Peter Dutton. I think you were talking about Peter Dutton, but there was no need during an election for him to turn up to any of his 7 nuclear sites because you've already shown that you have got social licence. Can I just challenge that? Like, if you did have social licence on what is a very bold and different, expensive policy, why wouldn't you turn up when there are votes to be won, not just at Collie and the Hunter, but in areas that are going to be critical to whether you win or lose? And on a similar vein, whatever happens on May 3rd, will nuclear power be a coalition policy from here on?
A good question, a contradictory one, the last one, about a bold policy when we were just lambasted for being a bland campaign. But you are right. This is
Karen's question stands. But
yeah, no, and I'll get to it. But I think it's important you understand where this comes. And the second part of that, I repudiate entirely, an expensive plan. And this has been the most disappointing aspect, I think, of the reporting, that Anthony Albanese has been able to call this a $600 billion nuclear power plant. Now, that's only going to give 4% of the grid that is going to have to need cuts. So Frontier Economics has got will have our power from nuclear around 38 to 39%, not 4%. It will not cost $600 billion. Frontier Economics clearly shows that the 12 to 13 gigawatt of power that we'll get, internationally it comes in at about $10 billion a gigawatt. That is about $120 billion for nuclear, but you've got to have other energies in that. Our plan, as Frontier Economics has clearly said, around 50 to 54% will be renewables. The balance will be some gas and snowy, obviously. That comes in just over $330 billion. So I can't understand the premise of a question where that claim by Anthony Albanese of a $600 billion hole doesn't end up on the editor's cutting floor, because that is a basic lie. Now, that the other piece of this that I think is also important is the cuts. This is being funded, as we have clearly said, as off budget. So that is not going to mean that you are going to have to reduce Medicare, you're going to have to reduce education or any other aspect of this. So I just think it's very important that we understand what the Prime Minister has not been held to account on. Now, in terms of those communities, 70 communities, it's been over 12 months since we identified those locations. And Andrew, before we got to that point, we didn't just go and throw a dart at the map and go, that's where we're going to put them. I have one in my own community. And you know what? I went there and sat with them, walked the streets, talked to the businesses, and said, tell me what your biggest issue is. Walking down the street of Kingaroy, Nanango, Yarraman, Guess what they said their biggest issue was? The local council and the quality of water that they got. I said, well, what else is upsetting you? Mate, the council. What about this nuclear thing? Well, are you going to build it? Because you know what, Andrew? Well, you sit here and think that it's so important that we go and rally the troops around every one of these nuclear power plants. These people have the lived experience.
Yeah, but that's not my question. My question is, if you've won social licence in the area, why don't you flaunt it? Why don't you flog your policy to the rest of Australia, because they're the ones who are going to count?
Well, with due respect, I am, and I'm just putting the challenge to you and to your editors to be very careful about allowing Anthony Albanese to perpetrate a blatant lie. A blatant lie that Frontier Economics, who they also take. Now, that is something for you guys to work through. I'm going to continue to prosecute. This is a legacy item I believe in, because you know what? You know what happens for the people of Kingaroy and Anango and Yarraman? They believe in themselves. They believe they can do this. The people of Lithgow believe they can do this. I back them. I back regional Australians to do this better than anyone else in the world. And I challenge Anthony Albanese or anyone else to go and stand in one of those coal-fired power stations and say, do you back these people? Do you back these people to use the most modern technology in the world and have jobs that aren't just polishing a few solar panels, but are high-paying jobs? High-paying jobs that we deserve, not have an ideology thrust upon us that we should have wind turbines, solar panels and transmission lines littered across our country that is tearing up your food security, is tearing up the very thing it's trying to protect. Now, this righteous view, we are all on this journey. I'm not against reducing emissions. But for people in capital cities to sit there and say they want to put their head on a pillow at night, to have the comfort of saying we've saved the world, just understand there's another way to do it. There's another way to do it that's cheaper, by $263 billion, which means you don't have to pay back that $263 billion with a return on top of it, that you don't have to pay that. And it's going to last 60 to 80 years, not something that lasts 10 to 15.
So it remains coalition policy come what may?
And I'll get to that as well, yeah. I mean, Peter Dutton yesterday said this is the way forward. And the Frontier Economics report was quite clear, and we've always been technology agnostic as well. I mean, Frontier Economics report, if your editors would want to read it and put it up instead of the $600 billion lie that Anthony Albanese has desperately tried to perpetrate, you would see that building a coal-fired power station with carbon capture storage is about the same cost or maybe a bit more expensive. So why wouldn't we have political leadership that has the courage to look the Australian people in the eye and say an all renewables approach will not work, because you cannot keep industry going. And you might get that warm comfort for another couple of years and think it's all going to be hokey-dory, but when you've got premiers coming in and asking people to turn dishwashers off, something's fundamentally going wrong. And the time for action is now. And we're not against renewables. I think, be very, very clear about that. Renewables will play a part in it, but we shouldn't have a concentration. And I learnt that at Chinchilla State High. Shouldn't have concentration risk. It's a good place to go and get a business economics degree.
Thanks, David.
All right, our next question.
Bush style, Andrew, Bush style.
Mike Foley is our next question.
Thanks, David. It's Mike Foley from the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age, which is pertinent because I have a question about Victoria specifically in relation to the nuclear policy. The first coal plant that the private operator has slated at its AGL to shut is Loy Yang A in 2035. They have a plan in place with the catchment authority to use their current entitlement of water at the ongoing rate around 100 gigalitres a year until 2070. And on top of that, as you would be aware, David, that there is no spare permanent water allocation in that catchment for irrigators or for anyone. On the face of it, on the current balance, there is no spare water entitlement to go for a nuclear power plant were it to be built there. Even when the coal plant shuts down, they need to fill the big, great brown coal pit up with water. So just wondering, when you spoke about the need for honesty in the energy debate just before and criticised Labor for kicking problems down the road, what will you say to farmers in that catchment now before they vote at the upcoming election on May 3 about where the water will come from to service a nuclear power plant that could be up and running in less than 15 years?
Well, as we've said, and I think you've seen our initial statements about identifying these locations, we made it very clear that the capacity of each of these plants will be constrained by the existing water entitlements that exist for those coal-fired power stations. And in fact, the University of New South Wales has undertaken a study and reported by the ABC, and I think it's from Professor Obard, I hope I got his pronunciation right, they made it very clear that there's not a significant difference in water usage between a coal-fired power station and a nuclear power plant. So there are other technologies also, Mike, in terms of dry cooling, but we have made it very clear, and what we will be saying and have said from the very outset to primary producers, there's nothing extra coming out of the consumptive pool. The consumptive pool we would lose our social licence for food processing and manufacturing in this country if we took that out of the consumptive pool. So it's important that we've given that as an ironclad guarantee, and we'll work within the capacity constraints, but also the technology solutions that provide themselves, and that may mean that in some locations their capacity is less, in others, particularly where you look at Lithgow, and if you looked at that report from Professor Obard, he made it very clear that there was more than significant water available in that catchment. So this is about being honest with those technical issues, and we've made it very clear that there is scope and capacity to be able to scale up or to scale down, but the guiding principle that we have looked every Australian farmer in the eye is that there will be no extra coming out of the consumptive pool.
Well, so, just on that with the dry cool, because this will be of extreme interest to the farmers I'm speaking to in the Latrobe Valley, there is, on the face of it, there is no spare water. Even when Loy Yang A shuts down, they need the current allocation to fill the mine pit up until 2070. Are you committing to do a dry cooled reactor there that doesn't require any water? And if so, they cost 2 to 3 times more to build in Russia. How do you square that circle with your current costings?
Well, what we have said, Mike, is clearly that the capacity constraints will be limited by the water entitlement that's available.
There's no water entitlement available there.
Mike, as I say, what we will do is work through with how that moves forward in individual sites, and where there is greater capacity, then that obviously we will start where there is existing and more than existing water entitlements to be able to square that away. And that may mean, after the scoping, that there is greater capacity in one site over another, or whether that water constraint is an issue. But we're not walking away from that ironclad guarantee. I'm from the bush. I used to be water minister. In fact, you did a tour with me that wasn't all that much fun as water minister. And I'm not taking anything out of the consumptive pool that takes anything away from our farmers. We've been very clear on that, and we will make sure that the geotechnical and scientific basis of how this is undertaken is done in a transparent way, but that is an ironclad guarantee.
Okay. So there will be a reactor in Latrobe Valley, but one that doesn't use water?
Well, again, Mike, we'll work through those assessments when we're in government, and we've set up the agency to make sure that we can give that transparency to the farmers. I think if we walk away from that principle, and I can assure you the conversations as a NAT I've had with Peter, that was a guiding principle for me, because I understand the importance of the consumptive pool and what this government is doing by taking another 450 gigalitres of water off farmers, changing the Murray-Darling Basin plan that they actually put in place. They're actually taking another 450 gigalitres of water, which are buybacks, and buybacks mean the little towns. It's not the farmers that hurt. It's actually the little businesses that are left behind, the pump shop, the CRT, right through to the cafe. And so we've got a water policy that this government has walked away from their own policy, all for a few votes in Adelaide, but at the expense of regional rural Australia. And I don't intend to follow down Labor's pathway.
All right, next question is from Greg Brown.
Greg Brown from The Australian, another one on nuclear, believe it or not.
It's good.
You said earlier, when you were talking about your influence as Nationals leader within the coalition, that you got nuclear. Does that mean you had to convince Peter Dutton to go along with this plan? And was it part of the Nationals, your demand for the Nationals to embrace net zero by 2050 yet again?
No, this was about Peter and I think Peter's had a long-held view, and I think it's honest to say, not all Liberals have. But Peter and I had that discussion, and it was important to me because, as I said earlier, I see the lived consequence of this, mate. I'm going to see 700 jobs lost in Kingaroy, Nanango, Yarraman, that rely on Tauranga Power Station. And all that's going to be left is about 20 to 30 jobs. And that's going to decimate communities unless we look pragmatically at this. So the conversation that Peter and I had was one that I think he came from a philosophical position the same as me.
Well, is it too much for you to credit yourself with saying, I got nuclear then, is that?
Well, it's been a long-term principle of the National Party for more than a decade. I'm proud of the fact that I and my party were able to work with Peter Dutton to achieve it. So politics is the art of self-promotion, as you'd know. And the Nats aren't immune to that either.
All right, you're doing well. Ron Meisen, our next question.
Okay, Ms Littleproud, thank you so much for your time and facing up to the press gallery during this campaign. I want to touch on two issues. One is an extension of the nuclear questions that you faced, and I'll just come back to this water. The water question, Darren Chester last week said that there would be a 2.5-year investigation to determine whether there was enough water available, seismology, earthquake risks. He said that there would be a process to determine all of that. And you've now put out this sort of ironclad guarantee that there will be no taking of water from the consumptive pool. If it turns out 2 or 3 locations, there's just not the water available, do those locations fall away from the plan? I mean, that seems to be the natural consequence of what you've said today. And just on childcare, you announced the $100 million for childcare deserts. In the mid-year budget update in December, the government put forward $500 million towards the Building Early Education Fund, which was a large pool of money also aimed at filling those childcare deserts. I'm not sure we've heard whether you're supportive of that fund, whether the $100 million is in addition to the 500 or whether it's a reduction.
Yep. So with respect to the water, that's not a new ironclad guarantee. That was one we gave when we announced our nuclear policy. We made it very clear, and that was a guiding principle.
You've had that water analysis done before guaranteeing 7 sites?
Well, yeah, in fact, you could do it. It's pretty easy. Each state authority, water authority, tells you exactly what the water entitlements are of each individual nuclear power plant. And then obviously engaging with Frontier Economics, not us, a bunch of politicians trying to make that up. We actually engage with Frontier Economics about what are the certainties and probabilities around what that would look like. So this wasn't just to throw a dart and hope for the best. This was about making sure that there was some analysis. And Darren is right. This process starts if we're elected with a mandate, and then it's a process to give assurance and comfort to the Australian people, but to those communities, that we're going to do this right. That we're going to back the process. We're going to back regional Australians to do this better than anyone else in the world. And the guiding principles have set where we will go with that. And I'm comfortable with that in protecting the consumptive pool and where that may go. But I think it's pretty clear to see when you've got analysis from Frontier, what there are the sites with more water than others, then it opens up that capacity opportunity in certain areas. But that's the honest conversation we've got to have with you. That's about making sure the process is respected, where you've got a process at the moment for renewable projects where basically there is no approval process. They waltz in, and I've sat with a man in Molong, an 85-year-old man, whose 2 sons don't talk to each other anymore. One's got the turbine, the other's got the transmission lines. He fears he's going to pass away before his 2 sons talk to each other. That's a reckless race that is predicated on ideology. And guess who bears the brunt? That bloke that's had 2 boys that he's been proud enough to bring back and give a start on their farms, and now he can't turn up to Christmas and sit there between them? I mean, really? Let's do this properly. And that's what we're saying. We're going to be honest with you all the way through. And we're not going to trample on any of the principles that we put in place. With respect to childcare, that'll be about, this is an additional $100 million that has been secured through the Regional Australia Future Fund. So it's in addition, because what's happened before is this is about targeting at infrastructure. So, and particularly for community run and council. And what you find is that many of these community run centres, they've got to raise money for a decade to probably raise $1 million to put on another 40 to 50 places. But if we give them a kickstart and allow them to build that capacity, So this is a targeted program specifically at that and around individuality, because a solution in Kempsey, where I was yesterday, is going to be different to that in Thargomindah or in Burke. So what we want to do is empower local communities, but this is a top-up. This is above and beyond, and it's needed because the programs of the past haven't isolated money solely for us. And when you get into a competitive process, and this is the challenge we find why regional Australia misses out, you get into a competitive process with metro areas and the criteria all skew towards bigger population. Guess who misses out? People in rural and remote areas. And, you know, I used to run about 20 bank managers across Western Queensland. I used to have some of my team would not come back after maternity leave because they couldn't find a place. Their careers, they've had to leave. That's not fair. If you live here in Canberra, if you want to go back to work, you've got that choice. And I don't understand why Anthony Albanese doesn't see this as an equity issue. You know, we don't ask for a lot in regional Australia. We just ask for a little bit. And when we're given $350 billion a year to the economy, I'm just asking for $20 billion that is funded by windfalls out of the budget until I get to that. And then you know what? I'm going to have a fund that no matter whoever's in the lodge, make sure that we're not the political football anymore. That's the legacy I want to leave behind. That's the legacy I want to know that when, either by popular demand or by my retirement as a member for Maranoa, I can look back and say, people I represent, I've changed their lives for the better. I've brought those young people home. I've kept them home. I've given them hope that they are valued as Australians. That's what gets me up in the morning, blows my hair back. That's why I do this job, is to leave that legacy. And when you see that, and you see families, and particularly young families who want to go back to work, that want to re-enter their careers, have so much to give. The opportunity cost for our country, I mean, it's valued here in the cities, but the opportunity cost of how many people we've lost, young families we've lost from the workforce in regional Australia, it's a national shame. We deserve that opportunity. And this is about making sure that legacy is stuck no matter who's in the lodge. And I made it clear to the Prime Minister when I became the leader in that. Let's have a secure funding model. Let's get rid of this pork barrelling claims and all this sort of stuff. I couldn't care less. I just want to see outcomes. I want to see outcomes for the people I represent so their future's the same, their hope's the same as those that live in Canberra, Sydney or Melbourne. Thanks,
and
mate.
Just while Anna Henderson makes her way to the microphone, I just wanted to ask you about another feature of the Coalition campaign this week, and that's been crime. We saw Peter Dutton in Dunkley holding a community forum. I know it's been a feature of the Wombat Trail as well, as you find pockets of this issue around the country. There's always a challenge in this issue between sort of perception versus reality. We know nationally statistics show that property crime has gone down in large parts of the country, and yet it has been a big focus. Is the Coalition capitalising on perceptions of fear when it comes to crime, or is this a reality that you're seeing when you're campaigning?
Well, ask that of the 70-year-old woman in Bendigo that I met that got on a train to go and watch her famous Richmond Tigers play, and she was abused by a young lady physically on a train. Ask her that. Are we simply going to work on a society predicated on statistics? The standard you walk past is the standard you accept. And this has a responsibility not just of state, but of federal and local governments. And I'm seeing local governments around the country leaning into this because they have the pride and passion of their communities. They don't want to see the standard of their society slip. And you know what? In Bendigo alone, for $360,000, we upgraded 37, or it might have been 57, CCTV cameras. The state wasn't going to do it. The council doesn't have the capacity to do it. So why wouldn't we, a program that we ran and ran successfully, that took the proceeds of crime and reinvest them back into community infrastructure to keep Australians safe? And where there are intersections of law, particularly with communications, then why wouldn't we do that? Why wouldn't we? We've all got a responsibility. And it's not just government's responsibility. We've got to lead, but as a society, and whether you talk about domestic violence today, it's not just government that has the responsibility. Every one of us does. And I think as a society, we've sometimes passed our responsibility and abrogated it to the state. We've all got a responsibility. I've got a responsibility as a father to talk to my boys about what's right and what's wrong, setting the standard. And it's not just money that'll fix it, it's us. It's us that'll fix it. Whether you're a politician, whether you're a role model in the sports club, we all got a role to play. And yep, we talk about the money we invest, but there's a bigger task, whether it be crime or domestic violence, that we can all live up to. And I think that's what Peter wants to make sure, as someone that has been in that darkest hour of some of the most vulnerable Australians, that he has an inherent want to fix this. And you know, I think shouldn't matter whether he's Prime Minister, Premier or Mayor. I think that's a great thing to have a leader that wants to do something.
All right, Anna Henderson.
Thank you for your address. Given it has become somewhat of an election issue, I just wanted to get your view on the recent natural disasters in Queensland and whether you personally believe in the science of climate change.
Yes, I do.
Great.
And Thargomindah, a perfect example. So we've had a flood event through there, 1974, 7.65 metres was the record. It beat it by nearly a metre. So obviously I respect the science, and we'll do whatever we can to make sure that we have an energy grid that's zero emissions. That's not dear. It's only $330 billion compared to an all renewables approach of $600 billion. And we're going to make sure that when I was Emergency Service Minister, I actually had in place the Emergency Response Fund, $5 billion fund that gave $100 million a year for mitigation public works, but also $50 million that was going into private works to be able to lift a house up, or in cyclone areas, renovate to make sure that they were ready for cyclones.
And just very briefly, your party was very emboldened by the successful No campaign for the referendum, in touch with the public mood. But has the coalition conflated the No campaign for the referendum with the broader mood of the electorate? Because in other countries, incumbents have been tossed out in this economic period, but at this stage, the polls suggest Labor is ahead. And if there's something wrong with the polls, what are the polls not seeing? Who are the polls not seeing?
Well, look, I think this is more a 2019 election than a 22 election. And I see that through the prism of our own track polling, of the seats that we're trying to win and the ones that we have challenges in. And the national polls, I think, aren't reflective that this is very much geographically based, this election. You go to Victoria, they've got the overlay of a horrible state government with a horrible federal government, and they're angry, and they've got every right to be, because they've got the lived experience of a government losing control of their streets and losing control of their economy. And so I think you'll see that we can all get carried away, and I actually personally don't think many people have actually switched on to this campaign. While we get excited in here about campaigns and the rigour of running around, even on the Wombat Trail, I don't think many people have actually engaged. They've had school holidays, they've had Easter, they've been camping, they've only just cleaned the tent up, put it away and put the kids back to school.
Well, 1 million have already voted. So.
Well, I think those are and that's a good point, but I think they're the ones that had made their mind up. I think you'll find there's a lot of the electorate that are very much starting to switch on now. And so I think it's dangerous to say that the national polls are reflective of what's happening on the ground. And that's why I think the next 9 days, I think people are running the ruler over it. And they're running the ruler over cost of living. That's what they're doing. They're asking themselves, am I better off after 3 years of Anthony Albanese? Will it be any better under an Albanese-banned coalition government? Or is there a solution for the here and now, and a government that's going to have the courage to fix the economy? Energy is the economy. And unless you're going to start that now, we're kicking this down the road another 3 years. And just imagine that with a coalition Labor Green government sprinkled with fairy dust from the Teals and independents. We are going to be in a very different place in 3 years' time if this country sees that. And I think Australians are going to put their lived experience against what they're facing, and I think they're going to switch on and run the ruler over pretty closely over the next 9 days.
Dom Giannini.
G'day, mate. Thanks for the speech. look, if everyone else had a couple bites of the cherry, I'm just wondering if I can get some clarity on a policy first and then ask the substantial. Will all of the 41,000 job cuts to the APS be in Canberra?
Yes, and what we've been very clear about is many of those haven't been employed yet. So they're budgeted, so they're on the budget, but in fact, we won't be putting those jobs on. So that means there is a saving. So we've been very clear about that. And in fact, if you look at some of the APS data, the Australian Public Service data, those that finished up with the public service last year was a bit over 10,000. So I think what you're going to see is there's a sensible way of doing this. But what we're saying is that we've got to have a public service that is nimble, it focuses on frontline services. We want more beds in hospitals and less deaths. That is what I think Australian taxpayers would expect of their government in delivering the public service that is fit to deliver that. And that's about making sure we do that respectfully and doing that sensibly, but living up to what our values and our priorities are as a government, and to make sure we do that properly. And that is saving the budget we'll have. And in fact, if you look at what's happening in the economy at the moment, the only sector where we're seeing job growth is in the public sector. Private sector is going nowhere. So at some point we need to get productivity back into the economy. And those people, those ones that haven't been employed, we would get a whole lot more out of them if they're working in the private sector, making a quid, making more taxes for these Australian people. That gives us even more services to be able to deliver.
But if all the job cuts come from Canberra, so there's only about 68,000 public servants here, so a large chunk of that's going to go, it'll impact the ACT economy. But on top of that, you said no cuts to frontline services. So like rough numbers have 4,300 Services Australia, 650 in Veterans, 380 NDIA, almost 9,000 in Defence and 3,000 in ASD. And you've got ASIS, ASIO and all the rest of them. So if you're not, that in itself, if you count those as frontline, are about 27,000. So where are these cuts going to come from?
Well, if you look at the numbers already, and in fact, since they've announced they started at 36,000 and I think they've now gone to 41,000. There has been less than 20,000 that have been employed, and there's 10,000 that have rolled off. So this is about making sure that we're not going to walk in and slash and burn day one. We're going to be respectful, and we're going to make sure we get the outcomes we're looking for. Now, that is what a good government would do. That's about being honest about how we're going to spend your money, making sure that when we say we're going to get to that point, we're going to do it with the right mechanisms to make sure that the frontline services aren't diminished, that those core principles are upheld, and that we get to the delivery services we want. But we don't necessarily have to tie more public service to bigger service delivery. There is other ways to get that in the public service, and we've been very clear. We believe there's a way to achieve that, to tap in to our great public service and all that they do, and not just around productivity, but thinking differently about how we actually are able to achieve what we're trying to do to get value for money for you as an Australian taxpayer.
All right, we've almost run out of time. Fascinating sort of array of questions today. I wanted to just ask you finally on supermarket divestiture. That's been a big focus for you. You said the supermarkets don't have anything to fear from a coalition government. What about Bunnings? Does Bunnings have anything to fear? Do they abuse their market power in your view?
Well, I think there's been evidence from those small family nurseries that supply them that I think the evidence mounts that there should be an extension to Bunnings. And that's why, again, Bunnings and Coles and Woolworths shouldn't fear it. If they're as pure as the driven snow and they respect competition law, then it'll never be used. But in society, you've got to have a deterrent and a consequence. If you don't have that, then you get those that would abuse that power take advantage of the little guy. And what the Nationals have always been is about the little guy. Protecting the little guy and trying to make the little guy become a big guy, because the big guy can look after themselves. What we want to do is make sure there is just fairness all the way through. That's the Australian way. And when we've already got it, we've already got these powers in place. And Anthony Albanese calls them Stalinistic. He signed up to them in January and went missing by February last year. I mean, really, does he understand the pain that Australians are feeling out there? Why wouldn't you, from the privileged position that we've been given, to go into that place up there and to actually make sure that we are giving every Australian a shot at dinner tonight? Why wouldn't we do that? We're a rich country. but we should be a smarter country, and that's what Peter and I are prepared to do.
David Littleproud, thank you for your address today.
Thank you.